there any kind of indication or just, is there a light or something?
Display here that'll come on.
Okay. Hello? mic now, so watch the profanity.
Keep it to a minimum.
Hello. Yeah. Hello, hello. Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Neil Doty. I'm the director of the College of Business Belief Ethics Program. And this is Belief Week, obviously. And this is our keynote address tonight. I first want to say thank you to all the speakers we've had coming in this week. All you students here know that we've had speakers coming into your classes. Many of them are alumni, and we're really happy and fortunate to have that because those people coming in and bringing their business experience directly to the students in the classroom is really a linchpin of belief. So any speakers here, thank you, and those who've been here and will be here this week, thank you very much. Our keynote speaker tonight is Tonya Robinson, the General Counsel from KPMG. Say hello to Tonya.
Hello. Hello. Thank you. Very nice.
Tonya is pinch hitting. We had another KPMG person lined up, and he couldn't make it. So Tonya has been recently, as 2 days ago, in Singapore, flying all over the world to get here. So we really appreciate the effort. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be
We also have several KPMG folks here, and we like to acknowledge them. They're really important partners with the College of Business. So thank you. Hello. You want to stand up? I'd also like to say hello to the College of Business students and faculty watching from Naperville and Hoffman Estates. This is being streamed out there, so hello to you folks as well. All right, so let me give you some background on Tonya. I have her biography here. It's an entire page. I will try to abridge it. It's so impressive. It's a very small font. Let me get my glasses. I'm going to read parts of this. It says, Tonya Robinson recently joined KPMG as its incoming general counsel effective October 1st, 2017. Previously, Tonya served as the acting general counsel at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, serving as legal advisor to the secretary and principal in charge of a legal office of nearly 600 professionals in HUD's headquarters, 10 regional offices, and 40 field offices. Prior to assuming the post of acting general counsel, Tonya served as principal deputy general counsel at HUD, and earlier as special assistant to the president for justice and regulatory policy at the White House. As special assistant to the president, she focused on a broad range of civil and criminal justice policy matters, including fair housing issues, sentencing reform, voting, and election reform. I'm going to skip down because there's so much. Prior to her service at the White House, Tonya was a partner at the international law firm WilmerHale LLP. Her practice at WilmerHale focused primarily on complex civil litigation and investigations, including congressional investigations, as well as discrete civil rights matters. Tonya started her legal career as a judicial clerk for the Honorable Francis D. Murnahan, Jr. on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Following her clerkship, she joined Wilmer, where she worked on a range of litigation matters. I'll move down again. She left Wilmer to work as a counsel to then Senator Joseph R. Biden on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Drugs. Skipping down again, Tonya received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Public Policy Studies and a certificate in Women's Studies from Duke University, where she also served as president of the undergraduate student body. She also obtained a postgraduate degree in African Studies from the University of Cape Town in South Africa as a Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholar, and her Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law School. So, yeah, how about it? So now you've got us all feeling super inadequate, so thank you for that. Thank you for that. I understand in your spare time you split the atom and play Rachmaninoff with one hand. Is that true? Yeah, okay. Okay, good. All right, so we have a scripted conversation we put together. This is Belief Week, and the topic is ethics. And so Tonya's background is a very rich one to explore because she's been in both the public and private sectors and is in law and has a lot of interesting background that we can dive into. So, all right? Okay, so with further ado, let me ask some questions. So you commenced your post as general counsel at KPMG about a year ago. What did you do professionally before joining KPMG?
Well, you pretty much covered it, Neil. Right before coming to KPMG about a year ago, I was a political appointee in the former administration. I was in the White House for a few years, where I led a small but mighty team focused on justice and regulatory policy issues. And during the second term, I was asked to move over to one of the federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, in part because the agency was getting a new secretary, hailing from Texas. Julian Castro came in at the top of the second administration. And so I went over there to support him and his leadership team and joined the Office of General Counsel there. So took a little bit of time off between that stint and coming to KPMG. Had been a private practice attorney before then. I lived and then worked in Washington, D.C. Was at a firm called Wilmer Cutler Pickering Helen Dorr. I was a litigation partner there. I did a mix of commercial litigation and more than a little bit of congressional investigations as well, and had really toggled between private practice and government. So I'd been on Capitol Hill before then. So I have a mix of experiences, to put it more generously. One of the senior partners told me I dabbled a lot in different items, and I don't think she intended it all that favorably, but it has been an interesting mix of experiences leading up to now.
Thank you. So this is not on the script, I don't think, but it's something I was curious about. Yeah. So let's go all the way back to your undergrad days. So you went to Duke as an undergrad, right?
I did.
So I'm curious, was there something like the Belief program, an ethics program at Duke when you were there?
Yeah.
And what was that like?
So no, nothing like the Belief program, but we had a really interesting public policy school. At the time, it was just an undergraduate program. Now it's a full-fledged school and graduate program at the university, and there was a heavy dose in that public policy curriculum around how do you get to good and right decisions. Good and right meaning just decisions, fair decisions, but it was all with an eye toward how do we make smart and reasonable public policy. Nothing quite like this. The business school there, the Fuqua School of Business, I presume probably had a component of it, but based on what I've learned about the program to date, where it's really quite integrated across the curriculum, it shows up in different parts of the academic experience. I don't remember anything quite like that at Duke.
Right. Yeah, I went to NIU as an undergrad a long time ago, and we did not have anything like Belief back then.
Yeah,
so I was,
no, it's quite
curious.
impressive. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, you were also at Harvard Law. So talk about that a little bit. I mean, obviously, I would assume that ethics has to be a big component of law school. Is that?
You would think, right?
But you would hope.
You would, yeah. I don't know if that's accurate though, which is interesting. It's so I had a wonderful experience at Harvard. It's a fairly large law school, and spent a good chunk of my time really focused on my classroom experience, but also very much wanting to get out into the world. So I was a legal aid law student, and in Massachusetts, you can do some limited practicing even before you are a graduate and licensed. So did that work. So ethics showed up. It didn't show up, I think, in all the places it needed to. So it has been quite an education for me since leaving law school around how you help clients navigate sticky situations. There was no class on that at Harvard. So learned a lot about contracts and a lot about how courts got to decisions over time, a lot about decision making, but not about how you navigate the gray areas, frankly. And in some ways, law school, at least when I was there, and it was a little while ago, but it's deceiving because it suggests that there's always a right and wrong, a black and white. And I think that Harvard in some ways has evolved since I was there, so what I'm saying now probably is not fully representative of a current student's experience there, but I was eager to hop into practice, in part because if you live any or work any before going into that sort of graduate program, you know that all things aren't black and white, and it's really experience that's helped me be able to figure out how to aid clients look around corners and expect the unexpected, but make decisions in moments where you don't have a whole lot of time to deliberate, but make decisions that get them to the right outcomes.
So when you were first out of law school, fresh out, do you think that you were prepared to understand and recognize ethical dilemmas that may have been presented to you and what to do about it?
Is that a trick question?
Yeah. No, it's not. Just curious.
So it's interesting. I took a little time off between undergraduate and law school, which I think was really quite helpful. So to answer your question, the short answer is no, but I think I had probably more experience than most, in part because of that prior work experience. I put a high premium on working, kind of getting out in the world. I had some experience living outside of the country. But I wouldn't say that rock solid judgment was my strength when I left law school. I've tried to hone that over time and have been really fortunate enough to be both in academic and work experiences where I had mentors and others who helped me lean into that. Meaning help me exercise decision making, but in a safe space. I don't know that in fact, I do know that I did not do that nearly as effectively then as I hope I do now.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I look back, when I got here and I saw what the Belief program is and how robust it is and helping you understand ethical dilemmas and giving you guidance on what to do about it, I realized that when I came out of college, I had none of that whatsoever. I had no idea. And it was really just luck that I didn't get caught up in these things that happen. And you look at things out in the business world like Wells Fargo when they were doing all the phony accounts and credit cards and whatnot, you know. And what happened there was the senior people were hammering the junior people and saying, we need more accounts, we need more accounts. And finally the junior people said, okay, you want more accounts? I'll give you more accounts, you know. And everyone just seemed to be okay with it, and they went along with it. And I easily could have been caught up in something like that as right out of college, right? You do what you're supposed to. So I'm just making a little plug here for the Belief program. I think that the students coming through the College of Business really have a leg up on certainly what I did and probably what you did. You know, it's ways to understand that and recognize those things.
Yeah. So, no, I think that's right, and it's in part because I guess as I've learned more about the Belief program, the idea of having a decision-making framework. I think that helps considerably. So knowing before you're in the midst of the crisis, what are the sorts of questions you should be asking yourself, being able to define that for yourself ahead of time, I think really puts you way ahead of the game.
Okay, great. So let's go back to more current in your career, so KPMG. So what attracted you to KPMG?
That's a good question. I will say, and I'm loath to say this with so many of my colleagues in the front row here, I did not plan to go to one of the big four. Had thought I actually might end back up in a large law firm in DC. That's where I spent the bulk of my career before joining the administration. But had an interesting experience at HUD. In-house department there, and got really excited about that work. I mean, working in-house is so different than being an outside counsel at a law firm. Just so much more dynamic, a lot more fast-paced, really interesting work, and you're locked arm in arm with your internal clients. And so that experience turned me on to there may be something else out there and kind of gave me license to think more broadly about what the next step might be for me. I also was in a really enviable spot in that my husband also was a political appointee, entirely different field, but I thought, when else will both of the income-earning adults in our household in some ways be unanchored and be able to decide, what do we want to do? So in moments of weakness, I would suggest that maybe opening up a bed and breakfast in the Caribbean would be the thing that we would want to do, which would send him over the edge, because both of us are far more risk averse than that. But it opened up a different set of opportunities, and so I started thinking and talking with folks about what it means to be an in-house attorney. This opportunity came to me unexpectedly, or at least awareness of it. But the moment that it did, it resonated. When I say the moment that it did, almost the second that it did. I was at a place in my career where finding a place that lined up with my personal values was just very, very important. And had the good fortune to have a series of conversations to get some window into the organization. It helped. That baked into the business model for a place like KPMG is doing the right thing. I mean, that's partly what we have this kind of higher purpose of protecting the capital markets. I mean, it's a part of our business model. We want to be seen by our clients as trusted advisors. So I was kind of at a place in my life and a place in my career where that became more important than almost everything else. And then the idea of doing good work, so this notion of KPMG kind of having a higher purpose, servicing our clients, and I think when you dig a bit, it's pretty profound. And we are helping keep hospitals solvent in parts of the country, or trying to improve the food supply, the chains. I mean, there are all kinds of really interesting work that's happening. So the opportunity to do that sort of good work, or at least to support it from my kind of lawyer's perch, and do it with good people. And I discovered through what was a fairly long process that KPMG is just populated with really good people. That was a pretty compelling combination for me.
Well, let me ask you something you brought up. You said that doing the right thing is baked in at KPMG.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how is it baked in there when it was not baked in so much at, say, Arthur Andersen? How do you
Well, I won't
avoid that sort of
judge.
thing?
So I will say, and I don't, having not, I should have the big caveat that during the Anderson debacle, I was on Capitol Hill. I was working for then Senator Biden on the Judiciary Committee, and there are some tiny parts of the Sarbanes-Oxley bill that our team worked on. So we, in some ways, lived through parts of that. And a lot of my colleagues at KPMG are, refugees from Anderson, frankly. And so having gotten to know them, I know that there were a lot of really wonderful people at Anderson who were, in some ways, victimized, sacrificed by kind of what happened there. And it's such a complicated story, so I won't even purport to try to unravel that here. But it's a good example in the sense that every day in places like KPMG and Arthur Andersen, there are choices that we're making. And we're so large. And one misstep, one moment of exercising, poor professional judgment can have huge consequences for a professional services firm like ours. We are in the people business. Our business is reliant on clients and regulators and other stakeholders trusting us. And so decisions that each individual in this really large organization is or are making will have profound impacts on the business, including its sustainability, whether or not it will be here in the next 100 years. So, so in that sense, I don't want to cordon Anderson or any number of other companies that have had a bad experience.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to do that. It's just more of how KPMG is. And to be fair to Arthur Andersen, what I've heard from people I've talked to is that exactly what you said. It was a small number of people made some bad decisions, and a lot of people suffered because of it.
Yeah, so. but it's a powerful lesson behind that. No, that and really, I think it's that sense, or at least one that I've come to appreciate, of individual responsibility. That really is at the core of our code of conduct. That's what drives it, this idea that each of us has some responsibility for protecting the ethical culture of our organization. And included in that is each of us has a responsibility to raise our hand. And that really goes throughout KPMG. And it's certainly not to say that bad things aren't happening at KPMG, but it's to say that wherever you are in the organization, if we're going to survive, if we're going to be as strong in the 150 year as we are today, it's going to be highly dependent on, folks every day making good decisions and doing the right thing.
So I'll come back to raising your hand in a minute, because that's farther in here. But a good segue is to all this is, so you're the general counsel at KPMG. So what is your role, and what do you think is your responsibility in setting the tone for an ethical workplace, an ethical company?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Our Office of General Counsel sits within a broader ethics and compliance shop. We have about 100 professionals. It's a mix of lawyers, forensic specialists, audit partners. We have several paralegals, admin staff, but all really focused on trying to help the firm comply with the law. And so a huge part of what we do is letting parts of our business understand what's legal and not, help us contract in ways that are legal, represent the firm where we're sued or suing others. But that's really kind of the baseline requirement. So we want, at base, folks to do to follow the letter of the law. We see ourselves as having a broader role, however, so we want to be in a position where we're helping our internal clients solve problems, and I think that includes working through sticky situations. We want to help them make good decisions. Well, the general counsel in particular has a special role vis-a-vis our board and management committee. So to the extent that there is a role in terms of tone at the top, we try to support that and contribute to that as well. But again, at least the way it's structured in OGC, and frankly the way I think it should be structured at every company, is that it's everyone's responsibility to kind of nurture, protect, preserve kind of the ethical culture within a company. So we play a relatively small part in supporting that broader effort.
Okay, so you talked about the senior people supporting downward, and that gets us back to raising your hand again. So we'll go back to that. It sounds like people at KPMG are encouraged to raise their hand. Can you talk about that? What is that, and how does that work?
Absolutely. So raise your hand is an important element of it. And I pause a moment because I think that don't want to suggest that we get it perfect or right all the time, but it really is at the core of our code of conduct. It's built in expressly that for this system to work, it's really dependent on each one of our 35,000 personnel kind of owning the ethical culture. Raise your hand means that if you see something that's wrong or not right, or if you don't see it but you hear about it, or if there's just something that makes you feel a little uneasy, you're not so certain, you think it may be just a bit off, the expectation is that you're going to let someone know. And you're going to raise your hand and be a bit of a noisy gong until it's addressed. And if you think it's not addressed adequately, that you'll continue to try to raise the question until we get it resolved or it's been elevated to the appropriate level. I pause because I think it's easier to say that, articulate that, and we do it in much more eloquent language than it is in practice. We bring in hundreds of young people every year into our organization. We have large engagements that really are managed and staffed by professionals at different stages in their career. And it's much easier for me to raise my hand and be quite insistent about it than it may be for a 25 or 28-year-old to do that. So a part of having a raise your hand culture is not just to articulate it in your code of conduct, but to figure out ways to really encourage folks to actualize that. I mean, one element of it is us also having a zero tolerance policy in terms of retaliation. So folks need to know that you can raise your hand and you're not going to be penalized for that. And every day, given how large our organization is, we're needing to figure out smarter, better, more creative ways to make sure we're messaging in the right way. But it's a challenge. I mean, we're a big organization in the US. We're an even larger organization globally, and there's quite a bit of transition. Folks coming into the organization, others retiring from the organization. So it really is a constant challenge and one around which we have to be quite vigilant.
So you have young people coming in every year, which is understandable, and I would assume they go through some kind of training on the culture and all that.
Yeah, not just the young folks. Old folks like me who come in laterally also go through the same training. The idea is to provide guidance on what the firm's expectations are. We want to clearly message around that. But the training, too, is always a challenge. I mean, there's one thing to tell folks what the expectations are, to signal where the resources are, but we've just had an exercise where we're wanting to figure out how do we do training in a way that helps it stick. So we built in fairly concrete examples in our code of conduct, for example, just to, as opposed to saying do the right thing, and recognizing that there's always going to be some measure of gray between provision 1.1 and provision 1.5 of your code of conduct. So wanting really to help folks navigate the space in between what we say is expected. So it's training, but I think we have to do so much more than that, and a part of that is wanting to give folks real life examples.
Okay, so I was going to ask you if people, beside the new people, get reinforcement. It sounds like they do.
Yeah, no, we absolutely do.
Do you get feedback from your clients? Is that how you're doing in that regard?
We do, and it's curious. I wonder if the full organization appreciates it. So every week or so we have, and I'm going to butcher the name, I might need a little bit of help, but we have a really impressive brand management team that oftentimes is going out and surveying some of our top clients and our not so top clients, getting feedback on why they've made the choices that they've made. There are moments, hopefully rare moments, where we're not retained, and so we go to those clients or hoped for clients and also get their feedback on where we might be falling down. And I periodically will see some of that reporting, but that's tracked and maintained internally pretty aggressively.
Okay. So back to your time in the public sector.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what types of ethical situations you may have seen there. You know, you don't have to name names, but like types, categories of situations or whatever. What kinds of things are particularly prevalent there?
Yeah. Well, no, it's interesting. I have thought a bit about this question of government versus commercial, and for me, the top line is not so different. Although I will say in government, it feels, and I think actually is, a lot more prescriptive. So there are some very clear rules about what you can and cannot do as a federal employee. Some fairly clear, though less clear, rules about what you can and cannot do as a former federal employee, and you're expected to stay on the right side of those rules. In a place like HUD, there are lots of resources, folks who are there to train you, support you, teach you, represent you if you happen to slip up. And so lots of things that are happening in the government that aren't great, but it's not for a shortage of rules, for sure. Not as many clear-cut rules, per se, in the commercial space. I mean, obviously, we're doing work with and for the government and have to abide by the relevant rules that apply there as well. But at least in my brief experience, and this was the case when I was in kind of private law firm practice as well, too, there's a much higher burden, I think, on the organization to think really critically about what kind of place it wants to be, beyond what the rules require, but what sort of culture do you want to nurture? You know, what do you want to message and how do you want to support your people? How do you want to develop talent? I mean, there's just this array of challenges that feed into what your, in our case, corporate culture will be, and requires a lot more diligence and work to figure that out and to nurse it over time. So in my short year, I've been a little surprised. We have dedicated, certainly at the leadership levels, but I think across the organization, a truckload of time to culture questions, and are in the midst of kind of a values and culture conversation now in a way that I never experienced in government.
Well, you said it before, at a place like KPMG, your reputation is everything, right? It's critical.
Yeah,
so
no, that's right.
When you were at a law firm, at law firms, do they have those discussions about culture? What kind of culture should we have? They even talk about that at a law firm?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. At my old firm, we did. I mean, it was a much smaller organization and at a different level for sure. We were kind of a quintessential Washington law firm. And interestingly enough, there were a lot of us who viewed ourselves as kind of public interest refugees who had found ourselves there. And so culture in a different kind of way was really important. It was thinking about how we were going to practice law, with whom we were going to practice law, and a real fidelity to what we thought was our public servant role, even as high-fee commercial litigators, for example. So a different kind of culture, but still really attentive to, you know, the kind of place that we wanted to work.
And did they talk about ethics?
No, that's interesting. So the ethics conversation is a different conversation. It's driven largely by a perspective on what the role of the lawyer is, which would include a discussion around professional rules of responsibility. And for the lawyers in the room, you'll know that, at least as a theoretical matter, the thought is that ethics is supposed to be infused in our rules of professional responsibility. We spent a lot of time on what a conflict of interest looks like, which is not quite an ethics conversation, but as a theoretical matter, the thought was that we were to be faithful to that set of standards that dictate what a responsible lawyer does and does not do.
In your remarks here, you also talk about drift from your core values.
Yeah.
And talk about that a little bit. Like, how do you think let's say a public company, a private company would recognize that they're drifting from their core values and what to do about it?
Yeah, I don't know that you do, and I'm glad you picked up on that. Our chairman introduced this wonderful text to us, Return on Integrity, and I'm going to have to pull out the quote because I hadn't quite thought about drift in that same way before she introduced the concept in the book to us. I don't know that you do know that you're moving away from, and I'll find the quote and we can maybe read it for the audience. But the whole notion is that rarely do we appreciate that we have moved away from what are our core values, our personal values, until we're a place that's far enough away from it that you don't even recognize it. It's almost a statement on you realize it when it's too late, which at least to me speaks to the importance of really taking this on as a very active exercise, this idea of monitoring yourself, being ever mindful about, am I being true to my personal values, my core beliefs? Are those personal values, core beliefs, assuming they're the right ones, are they reflected in the organization in which I'm working? Having your own kind of trusted advisors or truth tellers who you listen to, because you're often either in a crisis or having a bad decision before you appreciate that you have moved kind of far afield of where you began ethically.
Right. I was going to say that exact thing. It usually happens because of a crisis, and when you're in crisis, no one's thinking about that. They're thinking, how do I get out of this crisis?
Yeah, that's
And there's usually a lot of pressure, top down. Everyone's freaking out. So, what kind of advice would you give these students? Because I was in private business for a long time, and even in successful companies, you can get to points in the course of a year where there's a crisis. And maybe it's not an existential crisis for the company, but it's like a project level crisis or something. And people kind of lose track of their values. They're just not thinking about it then. So what kind of advice could you give young people entering the workforce on how to recognize that and what to do about it?
Well, I think a lot of what you guys presumably are already doing by virtue of you showing up here this evening. I mean, really the worst time to try to figure it out is in the middle of the crisis. I mean, you're not really well positioned to ask yourself what's important to you, kind of what's your North Star in the middle of a high pressure point where you're trying to make good and bad decisions with sometimes less than perfect information. So this idea of thinking about it ahead of time, I think, is really important, and trying to figure out at a very individual level what are your kind of core set of values, what's really important to you. And in many ways, for me personally, it starts with kind of sandbox lessons that I learned at C.C. Spalding Elementary School. I mean, this notion of being respectful, being kind, raising your hand, speak. So that there are a set of core principles I think we can, in some ways, agree on. I mean, we explain it in different terms when you get into corporate America, but I think there is a kind of common language that we can agree on, and having a conversation about what's important in your particular organization ahead of time, I think, can be the right sort of frame for a more difficult, hot, fast-paced moment in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, to plug the Belief program, I think these kids are trained to recognize these things. And I would tell all the students, when you get out in the work world, use your wallet card. No matter, and actually, like, the worst crisis, the more critical it is to pull out that wallet card and say, what do I do? Apply the test, what do I do? It's more important than ever when you get in crisis mode, because that's when people lose their bearings.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in here that you had looked at our handbook and whatnot, and saw our tests and whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the questions were, what test do you use or recommend using?
Oh, sure.
Just
Well,
talk
I
about
have
that.
to, yeah, well, I was going to say, most weeks I'm just trying not to embarrass the family. So there's a don't embarrass the family test. I've spent part of my career in government and politics, so there's the you don't want your client to show up on the front pages of the New York Times or Washington Post test. But the one that I think is most resilient is one that I just mentioned, which is kind of the North Star test. I think the best decisions are not the ones that are driven by the short-term goal. How do I avoid embarrassing my mother, or how do I stay out of the papers? It's really the set of decisions that are anchored by that core set of values. And for me, it's a real luxury to be able to always look to the North Star. So you're in the workplace, and there's a personnel matter that develops, or there's a question related to a client, and you're trying to figure out, do you keep the client and keep the revenue versus doing this other thing? And if you've had a conversation with yourself and in your organization about what's really important, doing quality work for our clients, being trusted, and I have to underscore trusted by our clients, doing right by our people. I mean, when you have a conversation about those core principles, that really takes you through so many other difficult conversations. So it's not about, although it is, have I embarrassed the family, or am I in the papers or not, but it's, am I being true to that core set of principles, the North Star.
So you're back in private business again, and I was just curious, it's only been a year, right? But have you noticed, just from being back in that realm and from what you see in the news and whatnot, any trends, ethical trends that these students might want to be aware of?
Yeah, well, there's there are several trends, but I did want to take the opportunity to plug KPMG. Forgive me for this. We do a CEO Outlook survey every year, and when I first started, I got a hold of the 2017 CEO Outlook survey, and it's a survey of maybe 400 CEOs. They're really from the biggest, most productive companies in the country. The bulk of them are CEOs of businesses that are in the $1 billion range, but some on either side of that marker. We ask them a series of questions. We have lots of, we say we as if I'm directly involved in this. I am not, but it's such an interesting read. And they talk about what's on their mind, like what do they see as challenges for their businesses. And so you can imagine all the things that would pop up: disruptive technologies, how do we manage talent, kind of HR issues. More than 80% of them in that 2017 survey highlighted values, trust, culture as being major drivers for their business strategy and the things on which their future success would be highly dependent. So you can imagine, for a person like me, sitting where I sit in the company, where values, trust, ethics, that's our wheelhouse, that's pretty exciting that that's so perfectly aligned with what the CEOs of the biggest companies in America are saying is going to be so important to the success of their business.
Yeah, to be cynical, they all say that, right?
They?
Sure, they all have a mission statement that sounds great and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
It's how they embody that
No, that's
matters,
absolutely right. No, that's
Yeah.
absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
So we have students in here who will be graduating soon and heading out into the workplace. I mean, what would you like to say to them?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. So it's funny. My not to go back to my mother, but I had to, when I first started, and I'm now forgetting the context, but I remember there being some event, and you have to submit basic information about yourself, and including advice that someone would give you. And I remember telling her that, I have to submit this information. And she said to me then what she had said to me when I started college, which is, Tonya, you are enough, and trust that. And it took me a moment to fully appreciate and understand what that meant. But a part of it was, trust your gut. Like, you're going to have these big opportunities ahead of you. You're going to go to fancy schools. You're going to sit in lovely auditoriums. But trust yourself. And that has really served me well. I bet that there are going to be few ethical crises that you will face. I bet you'll face many, or at least some. But few of them will be ones that your initial gut reaction doesn't lead you in the right direction. And even in my short time at KPMG, or my time before that in government, it was the moments where folks didn't trust that and act on it, where I think they were served least well. And in the moments where they trusted themselves, but also layered on a set of other requirements, like staying informed. So being in an organization and knowing that you need to be a student of that organization. You need to understand the policies and expectations. A whole host of other requirements in order to be a good steward within your organization, but at base, knowing that you have the right set of tools to guide you. You don't know everything, and so you'll need to know when to ask for counsel and not be afraid to ask for help. But you have the tools, and not to be afraid to use them.
I think not be afraid is key, right? They have to have courage, right?
Yeah.
And recognize these issues and have the courage to raise their hand and do something about it.
Sure, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Back to your background a little bit. I didn't touch on this, but it's so interesting. Cape Town, talk about that.
Oh. Yeah, Cape Town.
How did that come about, and what was that experience like?
Yeah. So I had just graduated from Duke, and I had spent a summer in Zimbabwe or Botswana. I grew up as a poor kid in North Carolina, and so didn't travel a whole lot at all, really, but had this experience of traveling.
You went to Raleigh and Durham, right?
I went to Raleigh and Durham,
right,
and
yeah.
not Raleigh very frequently. For those who don't know, Raleigh and Durham are about 15 minutes apart. So, so I mean, Duke opened up all kinds of opportunities and experiences for me. Traveling abroad was one of them, and so I spent some time in the southern part of the continent the year before, and was desperate to get back there. And oddly enough, I was student body president at Duke, and had what was the singular pleasure of welcoming back the NCAA champions back to Durham after their victory, which had been televised, and was presiding over the event. And a Rotarian out in the community saw me during that kind of public broadcast and said, "Have you ever thought about applying for this fellowship?" And that was kind of my ticket back to South Africa. Didn't quite anticipate what that would mean for a student of politics. Right after Mandela had been released, during their first kind of democratic presidential election, it was a really powerful moment. I mean, the country really was my classroom every day, which was exciting, but also, just to be honest, exhausting. And it was really kind of tumultuous year, to be honest. But so eye-opening, and it really was quite formative for me. I mean, it changed my direction in the sense I was a lot more focused on not just what I wanted to do professionally, but what was kind of important to me as a human. So when you think about how do you form your North Star, that was an important year for me.
Going abroad really gives you some perspective, doesn't it?
It really gives you some perspective, that's for sure. That's for sure. And then I became a graduate, so it was wonderful. I studied, got my degree, and was able to travel throughout the country and really experience that in a different kind of way, too.
Yeah, that sounds like quite an adventure.
No, it was. It really was.
How are we doing on time, by the way? No idea what time it is. Okay, we got 15 minutes left. Okay. Do you want to take any questions? I can come out and bring the microphone out. Any brave people want to? Let me come down. Who's going to be first? There we go.
Tonya, you rightly commented earlier how a small number of individuals at Arthur Andersen behaved in a way that caused great damage to a very reputable firm.
Yeah.
I wondered if you might comment on the incident that has been something of a reputation hit to KPMG with the PCAOB issue. If you might talk about, one, your perspective of how it happened, and secondly, how the firm has responded.
No, sure. No, it's a fair question. I should say, because it's ongoing, there's not a whole lot I can say about it, but I think there are some real lessons from it, frankly, that are really quite relevant. For those who aren't familiar with it, gosh, I think maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was a discovery that there were individuals within the firm who allegedly inappropriately accessed inspections information. I pause a moment because there's an active trial that's underway now litigating that. And I think perhaps more than anything, that is evidence of the power of raising your hand. That bad behavior by a handful of folks, and I mean really a handful of folks, surfaced because one of our partners in the field heard something that didn't quite sound right, and she raised her hand. The firm immediately reported it, investigated it, and importantly, terminated all of those individuals. So there are a few lessons there. One, the power of raising your hand, the importance of aligning your message with your practice. It was really important that our leadership in that moment get their arms around the facts, but also kind of given our role in the world, given the partnership we have with our clients, given these trusting relationships that we have to nurture, including trusting relationships with our regulators, it became critically important that we match up our speak with our actions, and that happened. It's something I'm incredibly proud of, even though this is ongoing and unfolding still. It feels as if really the firm acted in precisely the way, and I can say this because it predates me, but precisely in the way that one would want them to act when presented with such difficult circumstances. It also, I will say, and forgive me for the tangent, I was at the White House for a spell, and there were a couple of speeches that President Obama gave that always started something like, not everyone in the federal government is a bonehead, something like that. And then he would follow it with him retelling this story where Defense Secretary Gates had sat him down and said, Mr. President, you should know that right now, someone in the federal government is screwing up. And that's because there are 2 million people in the federal government. And even if 99% of them is doing the right thing, 1% of them may not be, and that's still a lot of people. And that, for me, is my KPMG experience. We are a firm of 35,000 people. And chances are, and I say this with some heartburn as the firm's GC, but chances are today, someone may have made a bad decision. I think that's going to happen in large organizations. And the real challenge, the trick, is how the organizations are going to respond to that. So I have assumed, I hope not the cynical perspective, that bad things are going to happen in dynamic organizations like ours. The important thing is for us to have the right set of structures, systems in place, to message in the right way to our people, to help folks like our partner in the field who raised her hand do that and know that she can do that and be supported and not be penalized, and then respond to it in the right way. So not everyone is boneheaded.
Who else? We got time for a couple more. Here we go.
Thank you. So referring to the 1% of people who are not doing the right thing, did you ever come across an ethical dilemma that had to do with any of those people? Because like you said, if we have like 1 million workers, 1% would be a pretty good amount of that. So.
Yeah. No, the short answer is yes. And I say that recognizing that in all of my jobs, like when I was in the federal government, working at HUD, one of the teams that reported up to me was the ethics team and the employment team. So I think the lawyers sit in a place in the organization where they see the underbelly perhaps more than most, and so we'll say people are making bad choices. What I will say though, and it's not foolproof, but the minority of folks who I've seen are making bad choices intentionally or because they're bad people. I think folks don't always have the right tools to manage through difficult situations. Folks sometimes haven't done the necessary work in order to position themselves to manage the difficult situations. And that's part of the work of a good code of conduct, for example. So you want to tell people what the rules are, you want to be clear about the expectations, but you want to give them the tools to make better decisions. Tools meaning training, resources, but also people resources, like your general counsel, who you can call and ask questions of. So in my line of business, I see folks who've made bad decisions a whole lot, but I have to say I'm really quite hopeful because I can probably count on one hand the number of folks who were just out to do bad or intended to do bad. It was really a bad set of circumstances and folks typically just not being equipped for the scenario that was before them.
Great question. Thank you. Here we go.
So good evening. Thank you for being here again.
Yeah, no, of course.
A quick question about, let's put myself in the story of assume I'm a first or second year at KPMG. How would I know if I come up with something, if I should be addressing it with a manager or addressing it with my general counsel, let's say?
No, sure.
How does that chain of communication work in the KPMG organization?
Yeah, well, depending on the issue, but for most issues, we encourage folks to follow their chain of command. So if something's troubling you, we want you to raise it with your immediate supervisor. Sometimes the thing that's troubling you is your immediate supervisor. So we try to create a path where you can raise it outside of that as well. And that's laid out in our policies. We also have a hotline where you can submit concerns and they be anonymous if you want them to be. And then you have access to any number of us who are in the ethics and compliance chain. So I'm on speed dial, and we have a team of folks who are available. We have a chief compliance officer. The idea is we want to encourage open and honest communication. So the systems aren't intended to discourage folks from engaging with their immediate supervisors or to disincentivize supervisors from engaging productively with their direct reports. So if that line is a viable one, we want to encourage that and encourage folks to elevate it up the chain, but want to make sure we're making available all these other paths should that not be one that's workable. And we see that when people have concerns, they're reporting it into our hotline. They'll send me an email or give us a call. There seems to be evidence that folks are taking full advantage of the alternative mechanisms that are available to them.
That's a great point you made, that a lot of times a person's direct supervisor is the one who is causing them distress, right? So there has to be a culture in place where you're allowed to go to the next step.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Who else?
So with artificial intelligence and machine learning right around the corner, have you, your colleagues, or any clients begun to look forward to potentially how you're going to handle these situations in technology?
Yeah, well, I will say it's not right around the corner. I am learning every day, and I have, there's a saying within KPMG that you should be a student of the firm. So I have become a student of the firm and have discovered that AI and cognitive solutions are here. It's certainly embedded in the firm's innovation agenda, and it presents all kinds of challenges for us and for our clients. The ethical components of that, I don't know that those have been fully explored or unbaked. There are a different set of demands that, at least from our corner of KPMG, we're very focused on. So to the extent that we have more and better access to data, for example, what are the different set of obligations and responsibilities that attach to that? Given that we have special responsibilities to our clients, including our responsibilities to keep their data confidential, given that we can use this data in bigger, better, more powerful ways, are there a set of duties that we have, including ethical duties around how that information and the technology is used? So I think those are really live questions, including at KPMG. I don't know that we've evolved it in a way where we've faced any real ethical crises around it, but as we think about how to develop it and deploy it, I think that's a really important component of it.
Great question. Let's take one more. Someone be brave, a student. How about you?
I don't have any questions.
Oh, that's so unfair.
Oh, okay, down here.
Hi, thanks for being here again. As a third-year law student, just you talked about how law school really helped you navigate the gray areas of ethical dilemmas. First, are you still like trying to navigate those gray areas? And if you are, who do you actually turn to, with the exception of the ARDC, with the gray areas?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I may have overstated the gray areas. I think that every day we are making choices, and for me, kind of good ethical decision making is kind of a lot like a muscle. You have to exercise it, and so there are a set of choices we're making that feel right. They're automatic, and I think it's partly because we've been making those decisions over time. They align with our, as we talked about earlier, our personal values. There are a set of more difficult decisions that I certainly face now, and that may be navigating the gray area, but the more that I have practiced that, the more that I exercise that muscle, the easier it has become. So I don't want to suggest that there aren't big problems that hop on my plate or on the radar of more senior professionals, but once you're in the routine of being able to spot the problem area, if you've done the pre-work of, for me, identifying your North Star issues, in some ways it makes the decision-making, even the tougher decision-making or the decision-making in the gray areas, easier than it would have been for me, 20 years ago, for example. So a lot of, tough decisions to be made, and we work in a really dynamic place. It's a large organization. We are solving big problems for our clients and within our firm. Tough choices to be made, but the choices don't feel that overwhelming when you have this core set of principles and you make all of your decisions with an eye toward being in alignment with those core principles. I hope that answers the question.
All right, thanks everybody for your questions. Before we go, I want to say there will be a reception right after downstairs, right? Is that right, Steve? So if you want the opportunity to speak with Tonya personally, that is your chance. We hope you join us. Everyone is welcome. Tonya, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, very good.